So there's one piece of Borderlands 4 that we've only gotten a small glimpse into that it seems like is going to be the best in Borderlands 4 compared to every previous Borderlands game, and that's mob density. Now, mob density has been talked about a little bit in the looter shooter genre, but not as much as the ARPG genre, which is the genre that inspired Borderlands and the looter shooter genre as a whole. Because mob density, just having ridiculous amounts of mobs on your screen, but also having a very good consistency of going pack to pack and always having a lot of enemies close by, is something that just makes these styles of loot-based games significantly more fun. That's actually one of the biggest things that I think has changed in something like Diablo 4 since launch, that they've kind of continuously increased the mob density, and those areas that have that crazy high mob density and really good consistency of mob density have just become some of the most fun areas of that game, and Borderlands 4 is looking kind of crazy when it comes to mob density. And there's a couple things that have seemed to tease this that makes me think the mob density is going to be crazy high, especially as we get more into the endgame. First off, in one of the trailers we've gotten, one of the characters is using a minigun from their ordnance slot, and in the field in front of them, 1 to 2 dozen enemies filling up this small area. And this does also seem to be showing a more high density area, most likely more towards the endgame, but there's legitimately in a small area just a ridiculous amount of enemies. Like, the enemies fill up the entirety of this area, just showing a ridiculous amount of mob density. And if they're doing mob density this high in an area on launch, there's definitely a very good chance that a lot of other areas can also have this density. Because if they do it in a specific area where they have, say, this many areas, say 2 dozen enemies on screen, they can generally do that in most areas based specifically on performance. Because that's also one of the big things about not being able to have like infinite density, is you put too many things on your screen, and not only does it get muddy with just effects and things everywhere, but it also just starts to drain your performance too much. So just that high of mob density already being in the game on launch and already being in trailers definitely points to Borderlands 4 being able to have a crazy high density. But then we have something that's kind of really important in that Borderlands 4 is not going to be on last generation consoles. Borderlands 3 was, and last generation consoles are very weak hardware compared to this generation of consoles and even very cheap PCs. So Borderlands 4 is going to be launching on PS5, Windows, so PCs, and Xbox Series X and S. So this generation consoles on PC. It's also going to be on Nintendo Switch 2 at some later date, but that'll probably be a much different version with a lot of things changed and toned down. Mainly, the game is launching all on this generation of systems, which are much more powerful. So that means they have much better performance. That means they're going to be allowing for much higher density. Randy Pitchford did also say that they are targeting 60 FPS for all of those systems, more specifically for the consoles, which is also a pretty good sign. Having that crazy high density, having a game like Borderlands that's going to have just crazy particle effects absolutely everywhere, them already saying they're targeting 60 FPS for consoles is also really good, especially since we've seen such high density already in the trailer. But then we also got a bunch of gameplay at the most recent showcase where the character was level 24 or 25, so that means they're kind of lower level, getting into the mid game, depending on what level max level is. Even if max level is only level 50 on launch, being level 25 is actually not even being in the mid game yet, because the higher levels usually take longer. So that's still a kind of earlier leveled character, and a good chunk of the gameplay we saw during the showcase at that level actually had really good density when compared to most other previous Borderlands games. And keep in mind, when you're lower level, they're not going to have the craziest density because you don't have the tools or the power yet to be able to take on crazy high density areas. But with that being said, the areas were still really high density when compared to all the previous Borderlands games, and that's only going to ramp as we get more into the end game and as we get to the higher density areas. So I think this also points to Endgame having ridiculously high mob density. Now, we don't yet know what type of different endgame content systems are going to be in Borderlands 4. Presumably, there's going to be some type of like horde defense mode. We kind of had something similar to that in Borderlands 3. There's probably going to be a bunch of other systems or modes that have varying degrees of mob density. Presumably, something like the horde defense mode will be really high density like it was in Borderlands 3. But then we also have the reveal that we are getting vault dungeons. We specifically know we're going to have to gather up these vaulty fragments to unlock those those dungeons, and they're calling them specifically vault dungeons instead of just vault. And they're specifically saying these are very difficult dungeons with very good loot in them. So these are presumably going to be much more difficult, much more end game pieces of content. And it almost sounds like they're describing takedowns. If you never played Borderlands 3, we had 2 takedowns, which were essentially Borderlands versions of raids. But if you actually play them and compare them to a lot of other ARPGs or MMOs, they function a bit more as a bigger dungeon with a raid boss in them. But these takedowns in Borderlands 3 had the craziest mob density, I think, in the entirety of the franchise, including in Borderlands 3 itself. Specifically, the Maliwan takedown had the craziest areas of mob density. Dozens of enemies on your screen at a time. And while that could get a bit laggy depending on your system, it was incredibly fun. It just felt like pure gameplay, and the gameplay of Borderlands 3 and Borderlands as a franchise is usually really good anyway and going to be better in Borderlands 4. So just having this crazy amount of mob density potential is going to be really fun. But taking it back to those vault dungeons, I'm presuming that these are going to have crazy high mob density and at least one boss within them. It wouldn't make sense for these things to be small like all previous vaults were. If they're now changing them to being called vault dungeons, now you have these key fragments you have to go collect to even unlock them. So my big theory is that these are going to be similar to takedowns, maybe not as many bosses and not as big, but I think they're going to be kind of smaller versions of takedowns, really difficult big boss in there, and a ridiculous degree of mob density, just dozens of enemies on your screen, which will inevitably be incredibly fun. And this last part is just a little bit more of a theory, but because of all of the different gear changes we're getting in Borderlands 4, I think some of it may be pointing at longer winded fights or just much higher intensity of fights, which could also just point to much higher mob density and just a lot more things you have to deal with. First off, we have more pieces of gear in Borderlands 4 than we've ever had. We have our 4 weapon slots, we have our ordnance slot, which is grenades or any heavy weapons. Then we have probably one of the biggest things that points towards this with the new repair item slot, which are essentially like stimulants. You'll be able to get different ones that heal you or regenerate shields or increase movement speed or give you damage buffs. They're essentially just this syringe support item that's another item slot that you can buff yourself or heal yourself with. And presumably having this new heal slot that we haven't had in previous Borderlands games means they're going to be allowed to throw more things at you, because if you're just taking too much damage, you can now just pop one of your charges of this new slot and heal yourself up a ton or fully replenish your shields or something like that. Giving you more tools in pretty much any game like this, especially RPGs, giving you more tools just allows them to throw more things at you because you have more ways to deal with it, meaning they can give you much higher mob density and crazier mechanics in boss fights when you have more tools to deal with it. Then we also have the new endgame firmware system, which on some of your slots, it'll be able to roll this firmware, which when you get 3 out of 3, it gives you a new effect, new damage boost, new utility. This is essentially gear sets in Borderlands 4 that the developers specifically described as endgame gearing. So this firmware slot having another gearing system on top of everything else as we get into the endgame means, again, they're just giving us more tools, more ways to customize our builds and our playstyles, meaning they can throw more things at us because we have more tools to deal with that. So all in all, I think mob density is going to be absolutely crazy in Borderlands 4, and this is one of the things I'm most excited to have continuous gameplay around, besides just having bosses we can constantly replay with the flip of the switch, but then also just having crazy high mob density areas, trying to create different builds that's really good at solving the issues in those areas. So I'm very excited to just go up against dozens of enemies at a time. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.